Win this hand of poker and I'll quit.
The CEO's words cut through the chatter like a blade. The charity event crowd erupted in laughter, their champagne glasses clinking as Richard Langston smirked across the green felt. At the far end of the table, David Hale, the janitor in his faded uniform, kept his hands steady on the cards. Richard leaned forward, voice dripping with mockery. "One hand, Hale. If you're lucky enough to beat me, I'll let you keep your little cleaning job. Lose. And maybe you'll consider crawling back to wherever you came from." The laughter died when David finally spoke. "Funny thing about bets," he said quietly, almost too calm. "Sometimes the stakes are bigger than the man who sets them." His words hung heavy, unsettling in a way the guests didn't expect, because beneath that mop and uniform was a man they didn't know, a man who once carried lives in his hands. And before the night was over, Richard Langston would learn that lesson in front of everyone. So if you don't want to miss the moment this table turns upside down, subscribe right now, because the reveal is coming faster than anyone in this room can imagine. David sat back in his chair, silent now, his calmness a jarring contrast to Richard's loud display. He wasn't rattled by the snickers, the glittering cufflinks, or the sneers tossed his way. He had been through worse storms than this. His eyes drifted toward the audience, toward the raised eyebrows and quiet whispers, and then to his daughter, Emily, watching from the side of the room. For her, he stayed seated. For her, he kept his dignity, no matter how heavy the humiliation felt. His wife had passed years earlier, and since then, every mop stroke, every night shift, every missed meal was for the small girl who still looked at him like he was the strongest man alive. Emily was his anchor, his reason, his quiet strength in a room filled with noise. Richard believed this was just a game. He saw a janitor sitting at his table, a man easy to dismiss, someone beneath him. But David knew differently. The CEO didn't realize he'd chosen the wrong opponent. Where are you watching from? Remember this moment, because Richard Langston has no idea that the janitor he just tried to crush is the one man who can flip the entire table with a single move. The cards hit the felt with a snap, and Richard leaned back, radiating smugness in his designer suit. The glow of chandeliers sparkled above, reflecting off the glass trophies displayed along the wall. Symbols of success Richard loved to flaunt. The air smelled of cologne, expensive whiskey, and superiority. David's uniform, by contrast, was marked with bleach stains. His shoes were worn from hours of pushing carts down marble corridors. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, the weight of judgment pressing down, as if his presence at the table was a violation. Still, he sat with a straight back, breathing evenly. Emily's gaze steadied him. At 10 years old, she didn't understand the full cruelty of the moment, but she knew what her father endured every day. She saw the laughter aimed at him, the smirks tossed his way, and David's silence was his shield. For her sake, he would not lash out. Richard's words echoed again. One hand, and you'll quit. To the CEO, this was sport, a way to show dominance, to remind everyone of their place in his empire. To David, it was something else entirely. It was a line in the sand, a chance to stand without shouting, a chance to remind his daughter that dignity didn't break just because a man in a suit decided to mock it. The crowd whispered as cards were dealt. Some pitied him. Others waited for the humiliation they thought inevitable. But David's expression never changed. His steady hands didn't shake and his eyes didn't dart nervously like they expected. He had spent years under harsher lights, making decisions in seconds that separated life from death. A poker table with a smirking CEO was nothing compared to those nights. Richard mistook calm for weakness. He mistook silence for fear. But David had learned long ago that quiet wasn't empty. It was power biding its time. And tonight, though no one in this glittering hall realized it yet, power was about to shift. The room seemed to lean in as the dealer slid the final card onto the felt. Richard Langston's grin widened, his jeweled cufflinks glinting under the chandelier. To him, this wasn't just a game, it was theater. He loved the spotlight, loved the way the guests hung on his every gesture, waiting for him to deliver the punchline. David Hale, in his faded uniform, didn't move. He kept his hands folded neatly in front of him, eyes fixed on the cards as if they were nothing more than another floor to mop. His calmness grated on Richard. Humiliation was supposed to sting, supposed to break a man down in front of a crowd. Instead, David sat like stone, refusing to give the CEO the satisfaction of a flinch. "Come on, Hale," Richard prodded, loud enough for the audience to hear. "Don't tell me you've forgotten how the game works. 2 cards down, 5 up. Try not to trip over the math." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to remind David exactly how these people saw him. Disposable, replaceable, invisible. But David didn't answer with words. He let his silence do the work. Every second he didn't rise to Richard's bait made the crowd shift uncomfortably. Even arrogance had limits, and Richard's performance was beginning to teeter on cruelty. Emily clutched the edge of her chair from across the room, her small face tilted toward her father, eyes wide, searching for reassurance. David gave her the slightest nod, steady, unbothered, enough to let her know he hadn't lost himself. The game continued. Chips clattered across the table as Richard pushed a towering stack forward, flexing the wealth he believed was power. "All in," he announced, leaning back with theatrical ease. "What do you say, Hale? Care to clean up after this too?" David studied the table. He wasn't playing for chips, not really. The stakes were his dignity, his daughter's pride, the invisible weight of years spent holding their lives together with calloused hands and silent sacrifice. He met Richard's eyes at last, and the faintest shadow of a smile touched his lips. "I'll call." Gasps rippled through the room. The janitor calling the CEO's bluff was entertainment no one expected. It was audacious, and the crowd leaned in closer, eager to see David fall flat. The river card came down, sealing the round. Richard slapped his cards face up with a flourish. 3 kings. The guests erupted, applause and laughter swirling like smoke. "Too easy," Richard crowed. "Looks like the janitor's luck ran out." David's hand moved with deliberate slowness. One by one, he turned his cards over. 2 aces, paired with the board, to complete a full house. The laughter cut off mid-breath. For a second, the room was silent, stunned into disbelief. Richard's smirk faltered, his confidence cracked under the weight of reality. David didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or celebrate. He simply pushed the modest pile of chips toward the center, stacking them with quiet precision. Then, without lifting his gaze from the felt, he said, "Sometimes, Mr. Langston, the hand you mock ends up being stronger than the one you brag about." The words struck harder than the cards. The crowd shifted uneasily, caught between amusement and awe. A janitor had just turned the CEO's stage into his own with nothing but calm patience and a winning hand. Richard's jaw tightened. For a man used to controlling every narrative, this small slip stung worse than he could admit. He straightened his shoulders, regaining composure with practiced ease, but the flush creeping up his neck betrayed him. David leaned back, finally lifting his eyes toward his daughter. Emily's face broke into a shy smile, pride glowing through her worry. That smile was worth more than the chips, more than the room's reaction. It was proof he hadn't let her down. But David knew better than to mistake one hand for victory. this was only the beginning. Richard Langston was the type of man who never forgave humiliation, no matter how small. Tonight's game had shifted something in the air, a tension that would only sharpen with time. The crowd returned to chatter, whispers about the janitor's luck rippling across tables. Some dismissed it as chance, others muttered about beginner's fortune, but a few exchanged knowing looks. David's composure, his unflinching silence, felt like something more than luck. Richard adjusted his cufflinks, forcing a chuckle. Well, even a broken clock is right twice a day. Enjoy your little win, Hale. Just remember, this is my table, my company, my rules. David didn't rise to the bait. He simply nodded as if acknowledging the truth of Richard's claim. On the surface, anyway. But deep down, he knew the night would bring a test Richard could never prepare for. One no amount of money, power, or arrogance could solve. And when that moment came, David wouldn't need cards or chips. He'd need the skill he had buried for years. The skill that had once saved lives and would, before long, save Richard's own son. David Hale rose from the poker table with unhurried grace, his uniform still marked with bleach stains, his face unreadable. Richard Langston's laughter had returned, thin and brittle this time, as he waved off the full house as a fluke. The crowd, restless and murmuring, began drifting back to their drinks and small talk. But the sting lingered. Richard's ego, bruised in public, demanded repayment. "Back to your mop, Hale," Richard called out, making sure the guests heard. "We wouldn't want anyone to think you actually belong here." The words rolled off David like water on glass. He gathered his things, checked once more on Emily at the edge of the room, and turned away. He knew Richard's type well enough. The more you ignored him, the harder he tried to dig under your skin. David had learned to fight different battles, the ones that mattered, the ones measured not in pride, but in survival. As he crossed the polished marble floor, whispers followed him, some mocking, some curious. A few of the younger executives whispered about his composure, impressed that a man dressed in a janitor's uniform had just called the CEO's bluff without breaking a sweat. It wasn't admiration exactly, but it was the first ripple against Richard's dominance. Emily hurried to his side, slipping her small hand into his. "You didn't let him win, Dad," she whispered, her eyes glowing with pride. David squeezed her hand gently. "Some games aren't about winning," he murmured. "They're about not letting someone else decide who you are." They walked together down the long corridor, past portraits of former executives glaring down from gilded frames. Every inch of the tower screamed wealth, mahogany doors, leather chairs, gold-trimmed vases, but David's focus never wavered from the child at his side. She was his world, and no room of powerful men could ever change that. Behind them, Richard's voice carried again, cutting through the hum of conversation. "You'll regret embarrassing me, Hale. One way or another, you'll be reminded of your place." David didn't look back. He'd been reminded of his place 1,000 times before, in words, in glances, in the weight of invisible barriers. What Richard couldn't see was that David's place wasn't measured in titles or suits. It was measured in the safety of the little girl walking beside him. They exited into the grand lobby, the towering glass windows reflecting the city lights beyond. Here, the divide between worlds sharpened. Even more, executives streamed past in tailored suits, while David moved through in his worn uniform, mop bucket waiting in the corner. Emily spotted it and frowned, her small shoulders tightening. "Why do they laugh at you, Dad?" she asked quietly. David crouched to her level, his tired eyes softening. "Because they don't understand," he said. "And when people don't understand, they make jokes. But what matters is that you understand me." Her nod was small, but fierce. She understood more than he wished she did. As David straightened, he caught sight of a familiar face. Mr. Collins, a security guard who had worked the building nearly as long as David. Collins gave him a respectful nod, murmuring under his breath, "Saw what you did up there." Not many would have kept their cool. David offered the faintest smile. A reputation leak. Small, quiet, but enough to ripple outward. Collins would talk, and others would listen. Soon, whispers about the janitor's steady hands and strange calm would move through the staff. No one yet knew the truth, that those same hands had once guided scalpels in trauma wards, stitching arteries and saving lives. But the seed of curiosity was planted. Richard didn't like seeds he couldn't control. From the mezzanine above, his eyes followed David like a hawk tracking prey. He adjusted his cufflinks, expression tight, already plotting how to erase the sting of humiliation. To him, David was not a man, but a problem that needed to be put back in place. David felt the weight of that gaze, but didn't flinch. He guided Emily to the service elevator, the one reserved for staff, its walls lined with scratched metal instead of polished marble. The doors closed, shutting out the glittering world above. For a moment, silence wrapped around them, heavy and safe. Emily leaned her head against his arm. "I like when you don't let him win," she said softly. David exhaled slowly, a mixture of exhaustion and pride. "One day," he said, "you'll understand that winning isn't always about the cards you hold. It's about how you carry yourself when the world wants you to fold." The elevator rumbled downward, each floor passing like a reminder of the divide he lived in every day. But beneath the exhaustion, something stirred. He knew tonight wasn't over. The CEO's son was still somewhere in that glittering ballroom, a child raised on wealth but not immune to fate. And fate had a way of testing the unprepared, no matter how powerful their fathers were. David didn't know when or how, but he sensed it. A storm was coming. One money and arrogance couldn't weather. And when it struck, the same people who laughed at him tonight would have no choice but to turn to the man they mocked. The service elevator rattled to a stop, the metallic doors opening into the quiet basement corridor. The hum of industrial lights and the faint smell of cleaning solvents replaced the glittering noise of the ballroom above. David Hale guided Emily out, her small shoes tapping against the concrete floor. He felt her grip tighten around his hand, sensing the weight pressing down on him, though she said nothing. Above them, Richard Langston was no doubt regaining control of the crowd, spinning the narrative back into his favor. Men like him always did. Yet David knew humiliation lingered, festering like an untreated wound. And he also knew Richard wasn't done with him. The storm he had sensed was drawing closer, step by step. "Dad," Emily whispered, her voice echoing softly in the empty hall. "Will he really try to hurt you?" David knelt, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "He can't hurt what matters most," he said. His voice was calm, but his mind replayed Richard's words. A man with that much power didn't let insults fade quietly. He walked her to the staff room, its linoleum floor and battered lockers standing in sharp contrast to the mahogany panels upstairs. He settled her into a chair with a small book she carried everywhere. "Stay here for a bit," he told her. "I need to finish my shift." Emily nodded reluctantly, her eyes lingering on him as if she sensed something he hadn't said. David gave her a reassuring smile, then picked up his mop and bucket. Outwardly, he looked like a man resigned to his lot. Inside, however, every sense was on edge. Upstairs, laughter still drifted faintly through the ventilation shafts, muffled and distant. David pushed his cart through the basement hallway, his movements efficient, practiced. To anyone watching, he was just a janitor doing his job. But every so often he'd pause, his eyes narrowing, his breathing steady. His years in trauma wards had trained him to detect changes, subtle cues that others overlooked. He felt it tonight in the air, a tension building like the silent moment before monitors screamed in the ER. He was right. The storm broke faster than he expected. A sudden commotion thundered through the floor above, shouts, glass shattering, the sharp scrape of chairs. David froze, mop handle clutched tight, his heart leaping into the rhythm he knew too well. Adrenaline, precise, controlled. He abandoned the bucket and bolted for the staff stairwell. He emerged into chaos. In the grand ballroom, the crowd had scattered from the poker table. Guests hovered in panic near the stage, their expensive gowns and suits jostling as they craned to see what had happened. And at the center of it all, sprawled on the floor, was Richard Langston's teenage son, Ethan. The boy's face was pale, lips swelling, chest rising in shallow gasps. His eyes rolled back, fingers clawing at his throat. A half-eaten shrimp cocktail lay overturned nearby, its tail still glistening. "Allergic reaction!" someone cried. Richard knelt beside his son, his face a mask of horror and helpless rage. He shook Ethan's shoulder, shouting his name, but panic strangled his voice. "Where's the medic? Call someone! Now!" Phones came out. Guests yelled for paramedics, but the seconds dragged like hours. Ethan's breathing worsened, his body convulsing as the reaction tightened its grip. Richard looked around wildly, his wealth and authority useless in the face of biology's cruelty. And then David stepped forward. He dropped to his knees beside the boy, his hands already moving, calm and decisive. "He's in anaphylaxis," David said, his voice sharp, commanding. "Call 911, get me an epinephrine injector, now." The crowd parted, stunned by the sudden authority in the janitor's tone. For a moment, no one moved. Then Collins, the security guard, barked at a waiter to check the medical kit. Snapping the guests into motion, David tilted Ethan's head back, checking his airway, counting the boy's pulse with 2 fingers against his neck. His mind was a steel trap, every step drilled into him by years of crisis. He remembered the trauma bay, the endless nights, the countless faces that blurred into one truth. Panic killed faster than injury. Richard's eyes snapped to him. "What are you doing? Get away from my son!" David didn't look up. "If I step away, he dies," he said flatly. The words cut through Richard's panic like glass. His protests died in his throat, leaving him frozen, forced to watch as the janitor he mocked took control. The waiter rushed back with a small kit. David tore it open, hands moving with practiced speed, and drew the injector. He pressed it firmly against Ethan's thigh and triggered the shot. The boy jolted, gasped, then began sucking in air, his chest rising a little stronger. Relief rippled through the crowd. Gasps turned into murmurs, and murmurs into stunned silence. In seconds, the narrative of the night had shifted. The janitor wasn't just a janitor. He was the only man who had acted while everyone else froze. David held Ethan steady, monitoring him closely, counting each breath, each heartbeat. His expression never wavered, but inside, something deep and familiar stirred. This was who he had been, who he still was, beneath the bleach stains and mops. The man who saved lives when seconds decided everything. Richard knelt helplessly at his son's side, eyes locked on David with something far more complicated than hatred. It was fear. It was dependence. And though he didn't know it yet, it was the beginning of his undoing. The ballroom had fallen into a stunned hush, broken only by Ethan's ragged breathing and the faint buzz of panicked voices on phones calling for paramedics. Guests who only minutes ago had laughed at Richard Langston's jokes now stood motionless, their jeweled hands clasped tight, their eyes fixed on the janitor kneeling beside the CEO's son. David Hale stayed calm, his hand steady on Ethan's wrist as he counted the pulse, his voice low and precise. He's stabilizing, but we keep his airway clear. Tilt his head slightly, keep him breathing steady. His instructions weren't shouted, but they carried with authority. Guests obeyed without thinking, as though instinctively recognizing the difference between command and control. Richard crouched awkwardly beside them, his cufflinks scraping the marble as his hands trembled against his son's arm. He looked up at David, the questions spilling out unbidden. "How do you know what to do?" David didn't answer. He didn't need to, not yet. This wasn't about him. It was about keeping the boy alive. He leaned closer, watching Ethan's chest rise and fall, waiting for the tightness to ease. Seconds stretched into eternity, but the boy's color slowly returned, the swelling easing enough for his breath to strengthen. Emily had pushed her way through the crowd by now, her small frame squeezing past expensive gowns and suits. She stopped just a step behind her father, her hands clenched against her chest. "Dad?" she whispered, worry trembling in her voice. David gave her a short nod, the calm reassurance of a man who had learned to steady others even in the worst storms. It was the same nod he once gave frantic nurses, terrified families, and patients clinging to life. Collins, the security guard, hovered near, eyes sharp. He'd known David for years, but he had never seen him like this, directing a room full of executives as if he belonged in charge. Collins muttered under his breath, just loud enough for those nearest to hear, "Man's done this before. You don't move like that unless you've been in the thick of it." The whisper spread fast. Guests traded glances, murmurs rippling across the marble floor. "Done this before? Who is he?" "Not just a janitor." The narrative was shifting, and Richard felt it like a noose tightening around his neck. Paramedics burst through the doors at last, wheeling a stretcher between them. The crowd parted immediately, relief flashing across nervous faces. But when they reached Ethan, they hesitated at the sight of David crouched in control of the scene. One of them, a tall medic with tired eyes, studied David with a flicker of recognition. "What's his status?" the medic asked. David rattled off the details with clinical precision. Severe allergic reaction, epinephrine administered, intramuscular, pulse steadying, airway partially obstructed but improving. Watch for rebound anaphylaxis. The medic blinked, then gave a quick nod. "Copy that." He motioned to his partner, and together they eased Ethan onto the stretcher. Richard stared at David, his confusion bleeding into something harsher, resentment mixed with reluctant awe. He wanted to demand answers, to reassert control, but the weight of so many eyes on him kept him silent. Everyone had seen the same thing. When wealth failed, when power faltered, it was the janitor who stepped forward. As the stretcher rolled toward the exit, Richard surged to his feet, his voice brittle. "Make sure he's taken to the private wing of St. Augustine's," he barked at the medics. "And spare no expense. Whatever he needs, he gets." But the words rang hollow. He was trying to reclaim authority, yet everyone knew who had truly held it in those crucial moments. David rose slowly, his knees stiff from crouching. Emily clung to his arm, her small face pressed into his sleeve. He let her stay there, grounding himself in her presence. He could feel the stares boring into him, some skeptical, some respectful, many unsettled. Richard finally turned on him, lowering his voice so only David could hear. "Don't think this changes anything. You humiliated me tonight, and I won't forget it. Whatever you're hiding, I'll find it." David met his gaze evenly, the faintest flicker of steel behind his calm eyes. "You should be more concerned with the son you nearly lost," he said softly. Richard's jaw clenched. He wanted to lash out, but the words froze him. For the first time, it wasn't just about dominance, it was about fear. The kind that came when money couldn't buy control, when arrogance couldn't save family. Guests began filtering out, murmurs following them like smoke. The story of what they had witnessed would spread by morning. A janitor with the composure of a surgeon. A CEO stripped bare in front of his peers. Emily tugged at her father's sleeve as the room thinned. "Dad, how did you know what to do so fast?" Her voice was hushed, curious, touched with awe. David glanced down at her, his expression softening. "Because once, before I was your dad with a mop, I was your dad with a different set of tools." It wasn't a full reveal, but it was enough. A sliver of truth, a promise that the mystery ran deeper. Emily's eyes widened, her pride mixing with wonder, and the guests who overheard leaned in, sensing a story they couldn't quite piece together yet. Upstairs, Richard's reputation was already cracking. Down here, in whispers and sidelong glances, David's was beginning to rise. The last of the guests drifted out of the ballroom, their whispers trailing behind them like smoke. David Hale stood near the now empty poker table, Emily's hand in his, the polished marble floor reflecting the fading chaos. The chandeliers still glittered overhead, but the room felt colder, quieter, stripped of its earlier grandeur. For David, the silence was familiar. The same quiet that always followed crisis, when the adrenaline ebbed, but the weight of what had just happened settled in. Emily looked up at him, her voice soft but insistent. "You saved him, Dad." Everyone saw. David squeezed her hand gently. "It wasn't about them watching," he said. "It was about making sure the boy got another breath." He let the truth hang there, calm and steady, though he knew the eyes of those who lingered were still fixed on him. Collins approached, his uniform cap tucked under his arm, his expression a mixture of respect and disbelief. "Hale," he muttered, keeping his voice low. "That wasn't the first time you've done something like that, was it?" David said nothing. His silence was answer enough. Collins gave a slow nod, his respect deepening. The security guard had always seen David as dependable, steady, but now he realized the janitor's composure came from something much larger, something earned in places most men never saw. From the mezzanine, Richard Langston reappeared, his shadow long against the wall. He had sent Ethan to the hospital with the paramedics, but the lines in his face betrayed exhaustion and fury. He descended the stairs with deliberate steps, the crowd's absence giving his presence a heavier weight. "You think tonight makes you a hero?" Richard's voice carried across the marble. "Don't fool yourself, Hale. You'll still be scrubbing my floors tomorrow. That's all you'll ever be." David didn't flinch. He simply straightened, Emily's small frame tucked close to his side. "You're wrong about one thing," he said evenly. "I don't measure myself by the floor I scrub or the table I sit at. I measure myself by who walks beside me." He looked down at Emily, then back at Richard. "And that's something you'll never understand." The words hit harder than a raised voice ever could. For a moment Richard faltered, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking away before he regained composure. Two junior executives who had lingered at the edge of the room exchanged murmurs. One whispered, "Did you see the way he handled the paramedics? Like he belonged in charge." The other nodded. "Collins said he's done it before. Makes you wonder what his story really is." The whispers were the beginning of a new narrative, one Richard couldn't control. It unsettled him more than David's quiet defiance. Reputation had always been his weapon, mockery, wealth, intimidation, but here, in his own tower, it was slipping from his grip. Emily tugged at her father's sleeve. "Can we go home, Dad?" David nodded. "Yes, it's time." They walked toward the service elevator, his cart and mop still waiting by the staff entrance. Each step carried the weight of the evening, but also a strange lightness. He had not come here to prove anything, yet something undeniable had been revealed. Richard's voice followed them. "You won't walk away from this, Hale. I'll find out who you really are. And when I do, you'll regret ever stepping into my world." David paused at the elevator, turning his head just enough for his words to carry. "You've already seen who I really am. You just don't want to admit it." The elevator doors slid shut, sealing the moment. Inside the small metal box, Emily leaned against him, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. David rested his hand gently on her shoulder, his mind replaying every second of Ethan's collapse. The signs, the reaction, the injection. It had all come back instinctively, as if no years had passed since he last wore a white coat. He thought he had buried that part of himself when his wife died, walking away from the career that had defined him. Being a trauma surgeon had cost him nights of sleep, years of strain, and finally the woman he loved. He had chosen Emily over all of it, trading hospitals for hallways, operating rooms for mop buckets. But tonight reminded him that the past never truly left. It waited, silent, until called again. The elevator opened into the dimly lit basement. David led Emily back to the staff room, settling her into the chair where her book still lay open. She was asleep before she finished leaning back, her small chest rising and falling in rhythm. He sat nearby, head bowed, the quiet pressing in. Above him, Richard's fury brewed, fueled by humiliation and fear. Below, in the silence of the basement, David allowed himself one breath of release. He had kept a boy alive. He had protected his daughter's pride. And though the world still called him Janitor, tonight the truth had slipped out through cracks no one could ignore. The whispers had begun, and whispers had a way of growing into truths too loud to silence. The hum of the basement lights blended with the soft rhythm of Emily's breathing. David Hale sat hunched in the metal chair beside her, his elbows resting on his knees, his mop leaning against the wall like an old companion. For a few precious moments, he allowed himself to rest, but even in the quiet, his mind was restless, turning over the night's events. He hadn't wanted to step back into that world. The world of decisions counted in seconds, of lives balanced on the edge of loss. Yet when Ethan Langston's throat closed, when fear gripped the room, his instincts had surged forward before he even realized. His hands had remembered everything. Now those same hands trembled, not from doubt, but from the knowledge of what came next. Richard Langston would not let tonight pass. Power never forgave humiliation. The staff door creaked open. Collins stepped in, his boots echoing on the linoleum. He glanced at Emily asleep in the chair, then back to David with a grave nod. "You know the building's buzzing already," he said quietly. "People are saying you saved the kid like you'd done it 100 times before. They're asking questions." David met his eyes evenly. "Let them ask. Answers won't change what happened." Collins leaned against the lockers, his voice low. "Langston's furious. He won't admit it out loud, but you embarrassed him in front of his circle, and now his son's life is tied to you. He'll try to spin it, or bury it." David gave a slow nod. He expected as much. Men like Richard lived off control, and tonight had shown him something he couldn't control. Emily stirred, rubbing her eyes. "Dad?" she murmured. "I'm here," David whispered, smoothing her hair. She blinked sleepily, then sat up, the shadows of the long night still heavy on her face. He smiled gently. "We'll be home soon." Before they could rise, the basement door swung open again. Richard stepped inside, his tailored suit jacket removed, his tie loosened, but his expression sharp as glass. His presence in the humble staff quarters felt like an intrusion, a king descending into the quarters of soldiers. David stood, his posture straight but calm. Emily pressed close to his side, her small hand gripping his shirt. Richard's eyes flicked to her before settling on David. "You think tonight changes anything?" His tone was cool, almost measured, but anger bled beneath the surface. "My son may be alive, but that doesn't make you my equal. Don't mistake gratitude for respect." David didn't rise to the bait. "Respect doesn't come from titles," he said simply. Richard's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only David could hear. "I'll find out who you are. Whatever past you're hiding, I'll drag it into the light. And when I do, you'll wish you'd stayed invisible." Emily stiffened, her breath quickening at the threat. David rested a reassuring hand on her shoulder, steady as stone. "You already saw who I am, Richard," he replied quietly. "You just can't admit it." Collins, still by the lockers, cleared his throat. "With respect, sir," he said carefully, "a lot of people saw what happened tonight. You can spin it however you like, but the staff, hell, even some of your guests, know the truth. Without him, your boy wouldn't have made it." Richard turned sharply, his glare slicing into Collins, but the guard didn't flinch. That was the problem with public moments. They had witnesses, and witnesses carried stories beyond the walls of boardrooms and poker tables. David held Richard's gaze, calm but unyielding. The silence stretched thick with tension. Finally, Richard snapped his cufflinks back into place and straightened his tie. "This isn't over," he said coldly. Then he turned on his heel and strode out, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Emily exhaled slowly, the air trembling in her chest. "He hates you," she whispered. David knelt, meeting her eyes. "Maybe, but hate isn't the same as power. Remember that." Her small hand squeezed his, and for a moment, strength passed between them like a silent vow. Collins shook his head, muttering, "Never seen him rattled like that. Whatever he throws at you next, Hale, it won't be small." David looked at Emily, then back at Collins. "Then we'll face it the same way we face everything else, one step at a time." He knew Collins was right. Richard's retaliation would be swift, calculated, and merciless. But the balance had shifted tonight. For the first time, Richard's grip on power had cracked, and once cracks formed, they had a way of spreading. As David gathered Emily's things, preparing to leave the staff room, he felt it deep in his bones. The reversal had begun. He hadn't wanted this fight, but fate had chosen the battleground. And in the days ahead, the truth of who he was and what he had once been would no longer remain hidden. The night outside was heavy with city lights, rain slicking the pavement into mirrors of neon. David Hale walked with Emily close to his side, her small backpack slung over her shoulder, her hand gripping his. They moved quietly toward the subway entrance, blending into the current of late-night commuters. To anyone watching, they were just another father and daughter heading home after a long shift. But beneath that surface, David felt the tremors of a storm building. Richard Langston's threats weren't idle. Power like his didn't tolerate defiance, especially not in public. David had seen it before. Executives who ruined rivals, leaders who crushed anyone who challenged them. The difference was that Richard's weapon was arrogance, while David's was something far sharper: experience. Emily broke the silence first. "Dad," she whispered, "is he really going to come after us?" David didn't answer right away. He led her down the subway steps, the air cooling as they descended. The rumble of trains echoed like distant thunder. Finally, he said, "He might try, but no matter what happens, we don't back down. Understand?" She nodded, her jaw tightening with a determination far too old for her age. He hated that she had to carry such weight, but he also knew she drew strength from his calm. Tonight had shown her a glimpse of who he really was, though she didn't yet grasp the full scope. When they boarded the train, David found them a corner seat. Emily leaned against his arm, her eyelids drooping from exhaustion. As she drifted toward sleep, David stared out the window at the tunnels flashing by. Memories surged, bright surgical lights, the clatter of instruments, the beeping of monitors. Lives saved, lives lost. Nights spent holding his wife's hand between shifts, promising her he'd slow down one day. That day had come too soon, forced by her illness, by the need to raise Emily alone. He thought he had left it all behind, but tonight proved otherwise. The skills he had buried weren't gone. They had been waiting, patient, like tools set aside for a day when the world demanded them again. The train screeched to a halt at their stop. David carried Emily up the steps, her head resting against his shoulder. Their apartment was modest, tucked into a weathered building where the paint peeled and the heater groaned. He laid her gently in bed, tucking the blanket under her chin. For a moment, he simply watched her sleep, her face peaceful despite the storm swirling around them. Then he moved to the small kitchen table, pulling out a worn notebook. It was the one remnant of his past life he hadn't been able to part with, filled with notes, sketches, and procedures. He opened it, his eyes scanning. Diagrams of airways, dosage calculations, emergency protocols. His hand traced the faded ink, and he exhaled slowly. Richard thought he could bury him under humiliation, but he didn't understand. David's quiet strength didn't come from pride or ego. It came from years of being forged in fire. And when another crisis struck, as it inevitably would, Richard would have no choice but to turn to the man he mocked. The following morning, whispers had already spread. By the time David returned to the tower, pushing his cart into the gleaming lobby, the staff were buzzing. "That janitor saved the CEO's kid," one whispered by the elevators. "Knew exactly what to do." Another added, "Collins swears he moved like a surgeon." The whispers were louder now, less cautious, carrying an edge of respect. David ignored them, moving steadily through his tasks, but he could feel the shift. His silence was no longer invisibility. It was mystery, and mystery was dangerous to men like Richard. On the executive floor, Richard paced behind glass walls, his phone pressed tight to his ear. His face was pale, his movements sharp. When he spotted David mopping the corridor, his expression darkened. He ended the call abruptly and stepped into the hall. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" Richard hissed, his voice low but venomous. "The whispers, the looks, the way people are starting to wonder about you. Don't fool yourself. They'll forget you the moment I remind them who you really are. A janitor." David wrung out the mop, his movements calm, deliberate. "Then why are you the one worried?" he asked quietly. Richard's eyes narrowed, his silence betraying the truth. He was worried, because no amount of spin could erase the fact that when his son's life was on the line, the janitor had stepped forward while everyone else froze. Emily appeared at the end of the hall, carrying her school bag, waiting for her father. She gave Richard a cautious glance, then ran to David's side. He placed a steady hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "Go on ahead," David said softly. "I'll catch up." She nodded, hurrying toward the elevators. Richard leaned closer, his voice sharp as broken glass. "This ends now. I'll find out everything about you, Hale. And when I do, I'll make sure you regret crossing me." David met his gaze, unshaken. "You don't need to look far. The truth is right in front of you. You just don't want to see it." Richard's glare followed him as David turned back to his mop, his silence heavier than any weapon. The balance of power had shifted, and though Richard refused to admit it, he had already begun to lose. David Hale finished the last pass of the mop across the corridor, the floor shining under the fluorescent lights. Behind the glass walls, Richard Langston retreated into his office, slamming the door hard enough for the sound to echo down the hall. David straightened slowly, ringing out the mop one last time. His silence was deliberate now, a weapon of patience. He rolled the cart toward the service elevator, his mind calm on the surface, but sharp beneath. Richard's threats weren't idle. They would come as reports, as background checks, as whispered rumors carefully planted. But David had nothing to hide except the very thing Richard most feared, the truth. When the elevator doors opened, Emily was waiting at the lobby, her school bag hanging awkwardly off one shoulder. She grinned when she saw him, but the smile faltered as she noticed the lines of tension on his face. "Did he say something again?" she asked. David placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the exit. "He said plenty, but words don't change who we are." They stepped out into the bright glass atrium, where staff and visitors passed in steady streams. The same whispers that had haunted David the night before now carried differently. Instead of mockery, there was a new note, curiosity, even quiet admiration. He caught fragments as they passed. "That's him. The CEO's son, right? He saved him. He's not just a janitor." Emily's small chin lifted a little higher, pride glowing through her cautious expression. David noticed, and a rare warmth touched his features. She needed this. Not for vanity, but for the reminder that her father wasn't defined by the bleach stains on his sleeves. Collins intercepted them at the revolving doors, his voice pitched low. "You should know, Hale. Langston's already digging. He's had his people pulling files all morning, but funny thing is, some of us think he's more rattled than he lets on." David arched an eyebrow. "Why's that?" Collins smirked faintly. "Because the harder he tries to bury what happened, the more people are talking about it. You can't buy silence when half the tower saw you save that kid." Emily's eyes widened at the guard's words, but David gave only a quiet nod. He had expected nothing less. The truth had a way of seeping out no matter how tightly men like Richard tried to bottle it. Later that afternoon, as David pushed his cart through the executive lounge, the murmur of conversation hushed. A group of junior executives, drinks in hand, watched him with open curiosity. One of them, braver than the rest, spoke up. "Hey, Hale, that thing you did last night, where'd you learn that?" David didn't stop moving. He pushed the mop bucket past them, his voice calm. "Experience." The single word carried weight, more than any explanation. The executives exchanged glances, unsettled by the mystery. David left them with their questions, refusing to fuel gossip, but knowing the whispers would only grow louder. Upstairs, Richard seethed. His phone buzzed with updates from private investigators, none of which brought him comfort. They confirmed fragments of David's past, hospital records, commendations, years as a trauma surgeon. But much of it was incomplete, scattered after David had left the field. To Richard, the gaps were infuriating. To the staff, the fragments were enough. By evening, the story had already taken root. The janitor who had once been a doctor. The man who saved the CEO's son when money and power couldn't. Richard stormed into the lobby, his voice raised as he confronted David in front of half the staff. "You think a lucky past makes you untouchable? You're nothing here, Hale. Nothing." The words rang hollow. The gathered crowd didn't laugh this time. They only watched, their eyes darting between the furious CEO and the man in the faded uniform who stood calm and silent. Emily, standing nearby, clenched her fists. David placed a steady hand on her shoulder, anchoring her. He looked at Richard with the same evenness he had carried in the trauma ward years before. If I were nothing, your son wouldn't be breathing today." The silence that followed was suffocating. No one dared to speak, but the weight of the truth settled over the room like a verdict. Richard's face flushed, his jaw clenched, but he could find no words. David turned away, guiding Emily toward the service elevator. Each step was deliberate, his calm presence speaking louder than Richard's rage. The crowd shifted slightly, their eyes following David instead of the man who technically signed their paychecks. The balance of power was tilting. What had started as whispers was becoming recognition, and soon, recognition would grow into something Richard couldn't silence: respect. As the elevator doors closed, Emily looked up at her father. "They believe in you now," she whispered. David's gaze softened. "What matters is that you believe in me," he replied. The elevator descended, leaving the lobby behind. Above them, Richard Langston stood alone in the glass atrium, his reflection fractured by the lights around him. For the first time in his career, he realized the crowd no longer laughed when he demanded it. The elevator door slid open into the dim basement, and David Hale stepped out with Emily at his side. The quiet hum of the building's machinery wrapped around them, a stark contrast to the charged silence they had left behind in the lobby. Emily clung to his sleeve, her face thoughtful, still processing what she had just witnessed. The crowd siding with her father in silence, and Richard Langston standing exposed for the first time. David guided her back to the small staff room, settling her into the chair she always claimed as her own. He brushed a hand across her hair, his voice low. "You did well up there. You didn't have to say a word. You just stood by me, and that's more than enough." Her eyes softened. "I wasn't scared. Not of him. I was scared for you." David crouched down, meeting her gaze. "Then you were braver than most of the people in that room." A knock at the door interrupted them. Collins stepped inside, closing it quickly behind him. His expression was tight, his jaw set. "Hale, you should know. Langston's not letting this go. He's calling an emergency meeting. Boardroom, top floor. Half the senior staff's already gathering." David rose slowly. "To do what? Spin the story?" Collins gave a grim nod. "More than that. He's going to try and bury you before the whispers grow into something bigger. But you've got allies now, whether you asked for them or not. People saw the truth last night, and they saw it again today. If Langston wants a spectacle, he may get one he can't control." Emily looked between them, her small face tightening. "Dad, don't go." David rested a hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes you don't get to choose the fight, sometimes it finds you." Minutes later, the service elevator carried him upward, each floor a reminder of the gulf between where he worked and where the powerful lived. By the time the doors opened on the executive level, he could already hear the raised voices. The boardroom glowed under recessed lighting, its walls lined with polished mahogany and abstract art. Around the vast table sat a cluster of executives, their faces taut with unease. At the head stood Richard Langston, his posture rigid, his voice sharp as he addressed the room. "And if we allow this narrative to continue," Richard was saying, "we lose control. We can't have the staff believing a janitor deserves the same respect as leadership. Discipline must be swift." The room murmured in uneasy agreement, but when the door opened and David walked in, silence fell. Richard's eyes narrowed. "You don't belong here, Hale." David didn't flinch. He stepped further into the room, his calm presence unsettling in its simplicity. "That's what you've told me since the beginning. But the truth is, none of you belonged in that moment last night. You froze. I didn't." The words hit like a stone, dropped into still water. The ripple spread instantly, executives shifting in their seats, some looking away, others staring openly. Richard barked a harsh laugh. "So what? You had one lucky moment, and now you think you can lecture us? David's voice stayed level. It wasn't luck. It was training. Years of it. Years of holding lives in my hands while the world fell apart around me. And when your son's throat closed, when the room panicked, all of that training came back. That's why he's still alive. Not luck, not money, not power. Skill. The weight of his words settled heavily. Collins, standing near the back of the room, nodded slightly, his silent confirmation echoing the truth. One of the board members, a woman in a Navy suit, leaned forward. "Is it true, then? You were a doctor?" David's eyes met hers. "Yes, a trauma surgeon. I walked away to raise my daughter when my wife died. I didn't ask to be dragged back into that world, but I won't stand by while you pretend the truth doesn't exist." The revelation spread through the room like fire. Executives whispered furiously, some clearly shaken, others intrigued. The narrative Richard had tried to bury had now been spoken aloud, undeniable. Richard's composure cracked, his voice rising with desperation. Don't be fooled. He abandoned his career. He chose a mop over a scalpel. That doesn't make him a hero. It makes him a failure. David met his fury with calm steel. If raising my daughter makes me a failure, then I'll wear that title proudly. Because the truth is this: last night, money and pride failed, but a man you dismissed, a man you humiliated, kept your son alive. And that isn't failure. That's the only reason you're not planning a funeral right now. The room erupted. Not in applause, but in the tense shuffle of shifting loyalties. The power dynamic had changed in front of them, and they all knew it. Richard slammed his fist onto the table. "Get out!" he roared. David didn't move. He stood his ground, his silence now thunderous. And in that silence, every witness saw the truth. Richard had lost control. The echo of Richard Langston's fist against the mahogany table still reverberated through the boardroom. His command to "get out" hung in the air, but David Hale remained where he stood, steady and unshaken. The silence stretched on, thick and oppressive, every executive present caught between the authority of their CEO and the undeniable reality of what they had witnessed. Richard's face burned crimson, his tie askew, his carefully cultivated image unraveling. He pointed a trembling finger at David. "You think you can humiliate me in my own tower, in front of my board?" David's voice was quiet, but its calm cut deeper than any shout. "I didn't humiliate you, Richard. You did that yourself when you mocked the wrong man, in front of the wrong crowd." Murmurs rippled through the board members. A few looked down at their hands, others exchanged glances, but none dared speak. The weight of the room shifted with every passing second. For once, Richard's dominance didn't fill the air. David's stillness did. From the back of the room, Collins stepped forward, breaking the tense silence. "With respect, sir," he said, addressing Richard but letting his gaze sweep the room, "it's not humiliation to tell the truth. Everyone here saw what happened. Everyone knows what would have happened if Hale hadn't stepped in." The words landed heavily. No one rushed to contradict him. The boardroom, usually so quick to echo Richard's authority, was unusually still. Richard spun back to his board, desperate to reassert control. "You're all forgetting yourselves. He's staff. Nothing more. He has no place in this room." But one of the directors, the woman in the Navy suit from earlier, finally spoke. Her voice was measured but firm. "With respect, Richard, place is earned. And last night, it wasn't you who saved it. Your son." A stunned hush fell. Richard's jaw worked furiously, but no words came. David's eyes flicked to the woman, then back to Richard. "This isn't about me taking your place. It's about you realizing that titles don't decide worth. Actions do." Richard's chest rose and fell with ragged fury. He looked around the table, searching for loyalty, for someone to echo his outrage. Instead, he found only uneasy faces. Even his most trusted allies avoided his gaze. The public confrontation had begun to unravel the hierarchy itself. David turned, his gaze sweeping the room. "I'm not asking for anything. I don't want a seat at this table. All I've ever wanted is to do my job and raise my daughter in peace. But when arrogance endangers lives, I won't stand silent. And you all saw the cost of silence." Emily's face flashed in his mind as he spoke, her wide eyes watching him at the poker table, her small voice whispering she was proud. This wasn't about triumph. It was about her, about dignity, about proving to her that quiet strength could stand against any tower of glass and steel. Richard's voice cracked like a whip, lashing out in desperation. "Enough. You think you've won some moral victory here? These people work for me, not for you." But the words had lost their power. The room was no longer his stage. Every eye turned to David, not with mockery this time, but with a dawning recognition that unsettled them. Collins stepped forward again. "With all due respect, sir, we don't work for fear. Not anymore." His voice rang with finality. Gasps rippled across the boardroom. It wasn't open rebellion, not yet, but it was the first crack in the wall Richard had built around himself for years. David gave a small nod of acknowledgement to Collins, then turned back to Richard. "You wanted me invisible. But the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface. You can't bury it, no matter how much power you think you hold." The tension in the room broke when the double doors opened suddenly. Staff from the lower floors had gathered in the hallway, drawn by the raised voices. Now they pressed into the room's edges, their eyes wide, whispering among themselves. The confrontation was no longer private. It was public, and it could not be contained. Richard saw it too. Panic flickered across his features, quickly buried under another mask of rage. "Out!" he screamed, pointing at David, his voice cracking with the strain. "Get out of my building." But no one moved to enforce it. Not Collins, not the executives, not even the staff who now filled the doorway. They only stood there, silent witnesses to the moment. David didn't shout. He didn't need to. His calm was louder than Richard's fury. "You can fire me. You can strip me of a uniform, but you can't erase what everyone here saw. Your son's life was in my hands, and I gave it back to you. That's the truth you'll never outrun." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard's authority, once unquestionable, now cracked in front of every witness. His own building, his own boardroom, had turned into a stage for his undoing. David turned at last, walking toward the doors. The crowd parted for him, their eyes following with something close to reverence. Emily was waiting just beyond, her small face filled with pride. Richard Langston, for the first time in years, stood alone in his own empire, his voice drowned not by shouts, but by silence. The boardroom doors shut behind David Hale with a heavy finality, sealing Richard Langston inside his fractured empire. The hallway was crowded now. Staff, assistants, even junior executives who had drifted from their offices to witness what could no longer be hidden. David walked through them in silence, Emily's hand gripping his tightly. Heads turned as he passed, whispers trailing after him. But this time the sound wasn't derision. It was respect. Emily looked up at him, her eyes wide with pride. "They were all watching you, Dad," she whispered. David gave a small smile. "What mattered is that you were watching. That's enough for me." Collins caught up, falling into step beside them. He kept his voice low, but his words carried weight. "You know what you did tonight, Hale? You shifted the ground under him. People won't forget this. Not the board, not the staff, not anyone who stood in that room." David nodded. "It was never about me being remembered. It was about showing my daughter what dignity looks like, even when someone tries to take it away. The crowd thinned as they reached the service elevator. David ushered Emily inside, and Collins gave him one last nod before the doors closed. "You've got more allies than you think," the guard said, his voice muffled as the gap narrowed. The ride down was quiet. Emily leaned against him, her head resting against his chest. David's eyes traced the scratched steel walls, the same ones that had carried him countless times before. But tonight, they felt different. This wasn't just a descent to the basement. It was a passage out of invisibility, a return to the truth he had tried to bury. When they stepped into the basement corridor, the quiet hum of machinery welcomed them back. David guided Emily into the staff room, helping her gather her things. She glanced around the modest space, the lockers, the battered chairs, the mop leaning against the wall, and then back at him. "Dad," she asked softly, "does this mean you're not just a janitor anymore?" He crouched in front of her, meeting her gaze with steady warmth. "Emily, I'll always be your dad first. That's the only title I need. But yes, some people finally saw what you've always known about me." Her smile bloomed, small but fierce, and for David, it was more powerful than any applause. Later that night, in their modest apartment, David stood at the window overlooking the city. The neon lights reflected off the rain-slicked streets below, a kaleidoscope of color against the dark. Behind him, Emily slept peacefully in her room, her small chest rising and falling with the rhythm of dreams. David rested his hand against the glass, the weight of years pressing down. He thought of his wife, of the nights he had stood in operating rooms with his hands inside broken bodies, of the moment he had walked away to save what truly mattered. Tonight the past had returned, not to haunt him, but to remind him that silence didn't erase who he was. The world now knew. The whispers were no longer dismissals, but acknowledgments. Richard Langston, once untouchable, had been forced to confront his own helplessness in front of his peers. And though the CEO would never admit defeat, the empire around him had already shifted. The janitor he mocked had revealed himself not through power plays or wealth, but through action when it mattered most. David let the silence of the room wash over him, a peace he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't seeking revenge or glory. He was seeking only to live with dignity, to raise his daughter with pride, to show her that strength wasn't loud. It was quiet, steady, unbreakable. When morning came, life would go on. He would pick up his mop, push his cart, walk the halls of glass and marble. But everyone who saw him now would know, and Richard Langston, for all his fury, could never erase that truth. David turned from the window, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. He whispered softly, almost as if speaking to the memory of his wife, "We're all right. She's safe. That's all that matters." And with that, he let the night close around him, not as a burden, but as a promise. The fight for dignity had been won. Now, before we close, I want to ask you something. What should our next story be titled? Because every title is another battle waiting to be told. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. Title: Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next?